climate bonds. That's just an indicator, a proof of concept, if you like. Of course, what we need are more investments that qualify, that are future fit. And that question about what qualifies, what it's about. The third thing that we have going for us is that we do actually have incredible knowledge around the solutions, the science. Regenerative agriculture is one of those key areas of investigation that give us hope for the future if we're able to unlock the power, the name of the session. Next, we need clarity of what to do, clarity for investors of what to invest. At Climate Bonds, we're working on catalytic agricultural investment guidance that will help with this program. Today's webinar is part of that series. We also will need incentives to ensure that capital will go in the right direction, to ensure that industry, agribusiness, farmers will go in one direction, not the other direction, the right direction. That's the work in progress. But today, in the meantime, we have a webinar to guide you, to inform you, to excite you, to energize you. Thank you so much for joining us. Please let me hand over to Maria, who will lead today's discussion.
Thank you so much, John, for those welcome words. Hello, everyone. I know that we have people that are joining us from all around the globe. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Maria Alejandra Pulido, and I am the Sustainable Agriculture Lead for the EU here in Climate Bonds. And I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar that has been brought to you in collaboration with Regen10 and Climate Bonds. Today, we will talk about unlocking the power of regenerative agriculture and a collaborative pathway to global food security, biodiversity conservation, and as well the net zero agri-food transition. We have brought together a stellar panel of experts for today's conversation. And actually, I'm very thrilled to welcome Theodora Ewert, who is the program manager of Regen10. Theo, we're really happy to have you here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me and really looking forward to the discussion today.
Now, please welcome Stefania Vanzini, Director of Planet Business for Biodiversity, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Hi, Stefania.
Hi, thank you for inviting the whole Regen10 team. Delighted to be here.
And I would like to introduce now to Luisa Volpe, who is the Advocacy, Policy and Partnership Practice Lead of the World Farmers Organization. Hi, Luisa.
Hi, Maria Alexandra. Hi, all. Thank you for having me here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Last but not least, please welcome Rachel Hemingway, who is the Head of Transitions here in Climate Bonds.
Delighted to be here. Thanks, Maria. Hello, all.
Now, before getting into the questions, I think that it's very important to highlight how regenerative agriculture focuses on restoring and as well enhancing the health of agriculture ecosystems. But it goes beyond sustainable practices by actively replenishing and regenerating natural resources. We can find how as common measures include increasing soil organic matter, retaining water, preventing erosion, and as well reducing reliance on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. However, despite how this approach is relevant in addressing the environmental challenges caused by the conventional agriculture and ensuring sustainable food production for the future, there is a lack of consensus on what exactly means regenerative agriculture. And this lack of alignment results in the confusion among the stakeholders regarding which ones are the potential outcomes, and moreover, the hinders ability to test and measure the global and local effects of this implementation. In such context, the frameworks, standards, and sector criteria can be crucial to facilitating and promoting the regenerative agriculture. So that's why we're here today, and we're going to be discussing together with the panel how we can create some standardized understanding and pathway for that meaning, and as well ensure how we can consist this sector transition and enhance the resilience by promoting healthier and more diverse and adaptable ecosystems. So thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to remind the audience that if you would like to interact with the audience, with the panelists, you are able to do that. So you just need to write your comments, your questions on the chat that you will find on the right side of your screen. Please don't wait till the end of the panel to do that. So now, to start the conversation, I'm really keen to understand from your perspective what is regenerative agriculture and what is needed to standardize that definition. Rachel, maybe you can give us some light on this.
Thanks, Maria. to be honest, you mentioned a lot of the things that are generally associated with regenerative agriculture in your introduction. And one of the things that you also highlighted is that there's no agreed definition of regenerative agriculture right now. You can almost look at it like a kind of set of principles as an approach to agriculture, which is intending to improve the environment with a strong focus on soil health, particularly. So the kind of goal of regenerative agriculture is to deliver a healthier, more productive environment, soil ecosystem, particularly within which to grow food. There's, as you said, there's a number of common processes and measures associated with that. There's things like minimum tillage, the use of cover crops to reduce erosion and water runoff, and intercropping and avoiding monoculture. So there's already a lot of things that are agreed. The problem is there's a lot of actors coming in now that are kind of new to the whole idea of regenerative agriculture. And I think it's causing a little bit of confusion with regard to the practice. So developing an agreement amongst experts, such as the people on this panel, is really important to provide a bit of clarity to the market. So there isn't this risk of greenwashing. So you don't have a big company coming in and saying, oh yes, we're doing regenerative practices, when in reality, all they've done is tweaked at the margins of a farm system without really making any big kind of change to the way that things are done. So I'll hand back to you so you can ask the question of others now as well.
Thank you, Rachel. I know that Stefania is very close to the business field, so I would like to ask you the same question, but from your perspective.
No, thank you. I was very much aligned with what Rachel was saying. So it's really about, it's a set of principles. For us, we also want to acknowledge where it comes from. So often we say it's very much related to agroecological principles. It's an outcome-based approach. So it's not prescriptive like organic, where you have to tick the boxes. It's more about, when we say outcomes, is because we're trying to measure the improvement that we can have on soil health, the carbon sequestration, that can, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the improvement of biodiversity in and around the farm, the improvement of water quality and retention, but it's also to do a little bit less harm. So we're also looking at the reduction of the use of synthetic inputs, which is also a key part of the business case. And maybe I also want to, so I would like to stress, to say, for us, regenerative agriculture, what's very important is that it's a holistic and outcome-based approach. These are probably the 2 points that are much important and that aims to achieve an impact on the 4 areas that I said. So it's climate, biodiversity, water, and also not last but not least, also farming livelihoods. So it goes beyond just the environmental outcomes. That is very important, I would say, for the businesses. And maybe I just want to stress one thing. It is, at least for businesses that are working in the agri-value chain, now it's an imperative to contribute to transition to a new agricultural model. It's about the resilience of their value chain. You were saying it very rightly in the introduction, that due to extreme climate weather events and to instability, either we change the current agricultural model or the current one is not working anymore. The current very intensive in monoculture is not providing the yields and productivity that we need. And this is why, for example, I represent a business coalition of more progressive companies that already 4 years ago said, we're all trying to change in our little, let's come together to align on which new agricultural model we want to promote. And they chose regenerative agriculture 4 years ago. And this is why I just wanted to stress why businesses are so engaged in it. It's really about the resilience of their supply chains. Back to you, Maria.
Thank you, Stefania, so much for bringing those aspects up. You were mentioning something very interesting here. Is about that holistic approach and as well the role that farmers have inside what is happening today with agriculture. So I would like to know, Luisa, in your perspective, considering that you're very close to the farmers' reality, how you are supporting the regenerative agriculture and how do you think that they can facilitate that common understanding of the concept?
Thank you very much, Maria Alejandra. Actually, already many concepts arose from the discussions, and many thoughts and ideas are coming to my mind, because also for us progressing work. You know, in last May, we held our General Assembly where almost 100 farmers organizations from all over the world were represented. And we held a consultation on regenerative agriculture. And it was really super interesting to notice that farmers have different views on regenerative agriculture in the sense of definition. But there are some points that are the same all over the world and for any kind of subsector of production system. And these are that the production system must be sustainable for the conservation of biodiversity and restoration, but also in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change, and above all, in terms of their existence as individuals, as farmers, as family, and as communities. And this for us is actually the first points that we have to look. There are people working in the farming sector, and this must be the priority. And farmers are the first one interested in having a sustainable or regenerative farming system, because it's really on their own, it really impacts on their own survival life. So they have this priority. Farmers are ready also to welcome science and innovation to improve the regenerative part of their work, and they are also open to receive trainings, for example, in the use of fertilizers to keep the soils healthy, or in the water management systems. They are really owning their own responsibility. This is the first point I wanted to make. And the second point is I really liked very much the holistic concept. It's true, we are in a system, we are in a food system, and food systems is not only the production systems, it's from producers to consumers and all those who are in the middle. So if we want to go to really achieve the regenerative agriculture sector, as we are really saying, we have to work on a framework together, agreed. The framework should be conceived by all the main actors. It's not just international experts. It's also the farmers providing the regenerative solutions that can give examples. But moreover, we have to review our collaboration within the value chain. So farmers and industry have to go to the same direction. Thank you very much.
I agree with you, and we're going to be able to get even deeper with other questions that we have. But before getting into those, I actually would like to hear as well about Theodore's perspective, because I know that you are leading an amazing work in Regen10. So I would like to connect that question with something else. I would like to ask you, how does an outcome-based framework evaluate the effectiveness of various agricultural practices in diverse contexts, particularly in developing positive results for people, nature, and climate? I think that both questions are quite related. So what do you think about this, Theodora?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I completely agree with what's been said before. And this movement to an outcomes framework really builds on what's been said already, is that and when I think about regenerative agriculture, we really need to move away from the concept of a defined set of practices, because we know that agriculture is very, very context specific, and a practice that leads to an outcome in one area could look very, very different in another area. And so actually moving away from practices to look at this very much holistic outcomes perspective that Stefania was speaking to, looking across environmental, social, economic outcomes that can really understand sort of what's happening on that farm in that context. By focusing too heavily on practices, you end up missing what actually could be happening with changing from a different practice. And when we think about regenerative agriculture as well, we want to move away from these silos of agricultural philosophies that there are. So Stefania mentioned before agroecology. We very much see regenerative agriculture in a synergy with agroecology, organic, climate smart. as long as they are achieving the positive outcomes and using this outcomes framework, we know that they're the right practices that are happening in the right places. So instead of looking at regenerative agriculture as this new hot topic, this new sort of movement, it's actually looking at it in a way that we can sort of frame it as outcomes, and then look at all agriculture in the lens of outcomes to really know that we can see that impact happening at the farm and landscape level, but by also focusing on these outcomes, it's aggregating the impact upwards as well. And we can start looking at how these practices in different places are actually achieving outcomes at sort of the global level when we look at biodiversity loss, climate change, food security, etc.
Thank you, Theodora. Rachel, I want to jump to you because I know that you can add as well different aspects to this question. I know that as well you're leading an amazing work here in CBI, so if you can give us more insights, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. I was just dying to jump in there because
I knew that.
You could see me, I want to get in. Because I completely agree with what you just said, that the outcomes are really important. And in a way, that's kind of what we're trying to do here, in that we're not creating any criteria for regenerative agriculture. We're creating a criteria for transition agriculture, which will lead to the outcomes that we want to see, which is, enhanced biodiversity, reduction in water use and wastage, better adaptation and mitigation, and also more of a just transition. The challenge with this is, and this is what I want to kind of almost throw back to you or ask you about, is this the measurement aspects of this. Because agriculture is so context specific, it's really difficult to have any kind of blanket measurements. It's a challenge for the actors, both on the ground, like the actual farmers implementing the practices, to really measure their outcomes unless they know the techniques of how to do it. So how do you measure soil organic content, for example? I mean, you have to go off to a lab and heat up a soil sample to 400 degrees and measure what's left and things. And so that's a challenge for the people on the ground to measure the outcomes. From a financial point of view, the actors are, they're often 3 or 4 times removed from the people on the ground. So the financial actors, the investors, they'll be investing in a company, and that company will have multiple suppliers and multiple supply chains diversified all over the world. So this question of measuring outcomes, to me, is definitely not a reason not to go for an outcome-based approach, because I agree different practices end with different outcomes. It's just more of a question of how can we do this in a really effective and not horrifically expensive, both in terms of money but also in terms of time, way. So that's a question thrown back to the group there, because I'd love to hear your ideas.
Thank you, Rachel. Stefania, I see that you would like to say something.
I can start, but I'm happy to hear also, because Theo is really very deep in this topic, to hear his views. But I can share the perspective how agribusinesses are actually doing it at the moment, because they are. But you're spot on one thing. It is to drive an outcome-based farming approach. This needs a huge effort on alignment. Not only on the outcomes, but also on the actual indicators and metrics we want to use. And effectively, as you said, we believe we even need to go all the way down to even aligning on the way we measure them. Because if you want to compare pears with pears and apples with apples, you actually need to measure, for example, soil organic carbon content almost in the same way to be able to compare. One thing, at least one pragmatic approach that companies that have already implemented the regenerative agricultural frameworks are doing is, it's about improvement. So all improvements is seen as beneficial. It's not improvement, of course, not only on one indicator, is improvement as it's holistic on the whole set of indicators that are part of the framework. But this gives a checklist that the farm is moving in the right direction. And how companies are, for example, doing it, they're putting in place also a dual system. So they're incentivizing the adoption of a basket of practices, not only one, because transitioning farms takes 3 to 5, sometimes even 7 years, depending on which crops we're growing. So it's about the adoption of a pool of practices that the farmer can choose, and these are incentivized. And then sometimes some indicators every year, some indicators only every 5 years, they are measured and then rewarded. So it's about basically offering a bonus or a price premium for the adoption of this. And so it's a dual system. It's aligning, as we say commercial efforts on this point. This is at least one answer, one pragmatic answer is how agribusinesses, so off-takers in the farming jargon, are taking. But happy to hear my colleagues' perspective on that.
Thank you, Stefania. Luisa, before getting into the next question that is related with what Rachel and Stefania were saying, I want to ask you would like to add anything to this?
I actually have a question for Stefania. Yeah, because I mean, you asked how is our companies transitioning to regenerative agriculture, and the answer is assessing the farmers. Now, sorry if I laughed, but this is very frustrating for us to hear, and it's also, I'm also actually conveying the frustration of farmers because they are often targeted as those who are responsible for climate change, for biodiversity usage, and not conservation, etc. Which may be also true. But then, are we sure that farmers are the only ones that are really exploiting this planet? And then my question is, how many natural resources, as for example, using the industries to process the food in terms of water, energy, any kind? So, and I want to go back to my point of before, Maria Alexandra, when I said farmers and industry should go to the same direction, revising the collaboration. Maybe the contract farming could be a good way to start from, but we should all take our responsibilities. In terms of production systems, for example, agriculture is the only sector that is able to sequester carbon. Is the industry able to do the same? So, I mean, I would like to add complexity to the discussion because this is the way I like to see it.
You're bringing it. Thank you so much for that. Stefania, so I think that you don't have a choice.
No, but I would love to, because Luisa, this is a very good point. And I think, or at least maybe not everyone, but at least the agribusinesses I often talk to, they say exactly the same thing. They say we are all part of the transformation. And so they're doing their part on their, what we can call maybe scope 1 and scope 2. So how are they reducing their negative impacts? But whenever they then look at where our biggest negative impacts, for example, on greenhouse gas emission, it's often what they call scope 3, which means in their value chain at the farm level. But here it's not for the agribusinesses I'm talking about. Farming is part of the solution. And this is why they have all committed to invest millions in the transition to regenerative agriculture. What are they proposing? Often is they're trying to finance the trainings on the ground to support farmers. They're putting in place the commercial benefits that I was talking about, the price premium. And sometimes they go all the way to try to have preferential ag loans from banks to make sure that the upfront capex costs are covered. But I agree with you on one very important point, which is at the moment, the risks of the transition. So if a farmer wants to decide to transition, they are way too much on the shoulders of the farmers. And this is also why I'm so excited to have this conversation with all the people here online too. It's because we really need the financial sector to step up, to really de-risk the farmer transition. And also, let's be honest, also reduce the cost and bringing also the public sector to finance it. There needs to be more money on the table for agriculture. And then more money for agriculture, for regenerative agriculture, let's call it like that, but for an agricultural system that is more positive for people, climate, and nature. So this is why I'm effectively very excited to be in this conversation, to hear also what the audience has to say on this topic.
Thank you,
Thank you, Mariam.
Now, I would like to ask you, Rachel, so which one is the role of financial institutions in leading the transition towards regenerative food systems? And I'm asking you this is because we have been talking about the different actors inside the value chain, farmers, corporates, but what about financial institutions?
I think financial institutions, so when we talk about financial institutions, there's a lot of different actors in the agri space. I mean, in some spaces, a corporate is also a financial institution because there's a lot of loans coming from corporates to farmers to implement specific measures or buy specific machinery. So the financial institution universe in agriculture is quite broad, and they'll have different roles. But as Stefania said, one of the really big roles of finance in agriculture and supporting this shift to a better agricultural system is to de-risk the work that needs to be done by the farmers on the ground. So this de-risking comes in all different types of instruments. All different shapes and forms of finance can be de-risking, from insurance and reduced cost insurance to credit risk instruments to reduce the risk for actors who are going to invest in agriculture, to preferential loans and preferential interest rates to farmers who want to implement different measures. So there's the role of finance it's an enabler on the one side. So it provides the money and enables the action to be undertaken by other actors. On the other side, there is also a role in finance in driving forward the demand for different agricultural practices. So particularly pension funds and big institutional investors like that, they want long-term, not necessarily massive yield investments that are relatively stable and that are quite often they want some sustainability elements or key performance indicators in those long-term, often bond structures as well. So you'll have funds that have been driven by pension funds and the intention of those is to directly identify best practice and fund that best practice with lower interest rates. So it's, on the one side, finance has an enabling role to de-risk the necessary actions, and on the other hand, it acts as a driver for change as well, because essentially also partly because of risk, but also partly because institutional investors and commercial investors want to have sustainability KPIs or ESG indicators on their books and on their portfolios. But again, happy to throw this open to others. I don't want to hog the conversation.
Thank you, Rachel. Theodora, we have been talking about how collaboration among various stakeholders can assist in scaling up regenerative food systems worldwide. I know that as well, Regen10 has a particular approach on this. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I was hoping this would come up because it's nice to hear sort of the point of view from different stakeholders, but actually what's super critical here is that we do find this space for collaboration. And this is the purpose of Regen10, and Regen10 was set up to be this multi-stakeholder inclusive platform that could answer the question around what it would take this decade for 50% of the world's food to be produced in a way that was good for people, planet, and nature, and climate. So a group of organizations have come together, which includes WBCSD and WFO, who are on the call today, but alongside IUCN, Systemic, and WBCSD. And we've come together to really understand what sort of the pathway forward would be through this collaborative approach. And with the priority being this deep farmer-centric and deep inclusive approach. So really doing it sort of, so it's benefiting the farmers and the food producers and really working with them. But at the same time, knowing this work needs to be connected to the supply chain. So how can we create a space, a multi-stakeholder space, to bring these groups together. And one of the really, really key parts of that is trying to sort of align around what we mean by regenerative. And that's what's sort of come up and the point of this question today. How can we get alignment across the industries around what are the outcomes that are regenerative? So within the work that we're doing at Regen10, specifically focusing on the framework development, we're looking to establish a universal framework that has sort of universal outcomes that can be aligned across all of these stakeholder groups. And going back to your point before a bit, Rachel, it is a bit difficult, right, when you get down to the granularity, the metrics and the indicators. We recognize that these could look different in different places. So our hypothesis starting point now is that we develop a standardized sort of universal outcomes framework that really shows the holistic elements of regenerative, including social, because as we know, there's been sort of a history of regenerative focusing on the environment, but really bringing in this social element as well. And this then will have the set of outcomes and a set of indicators and metrics that will go out and actually test the framework. We're going to go to a diverse set of different contexts to actually test what that framework looks like on the ground. And this will help us to flesh out, can we get standardized indicators? Do they work in all the different contexts that we've identified? And similar with the metrics and the data points. And I think what we ultimately want to do is develop a framework that can be used and useful to the farmer. So we'll test that with them. How does it resonate? Does this measurement work for you? And then what are those additional indicators that are like, this is too costly and time consuming, this framework's too much? And I think this is especially where we need to then look to the rest of the supply chain. And they're really, really key areas to drive incentives to help with that data collection, to understand the monitoring of those outcomes. And maybe just to add as well, sort of just that was just zooming in on the frameworks work stream of Regen10, but we're also very much working and learning from landscapes. We've got a landscapes team that are going to a diverse set of landscapes and speaking to the different actors within that. So going from the farmers, the indigenous groups, but also the big and small business actors and governments that work in that, and understanding what a successful transition looks like. So as well as using the framework, actually looking at sort of the enabling conditions that happen with different landscapes and how we can learn and take that forward to help the transition happen elsewhere.
Thank you, Theodora. This is starting to make me think that we need to consider different aspects. It's not just about food. It's not just about waste, water integration. It's about as well other communities that are being affected, and not only the responsibility that we can have from the farmers. I'm talking about the indigenous communities and their implications as well inside this value chain. And we have a very interesting comment from the audience. This is coming from David Benjamin, who is saying that according to the people that he's working with and as well his experience, the indigenous community in regenerative agriculture might be more than just solid wealth. I mean, it's not just about soil health, it's as well about getting further and deeper into those integrations and resilience. So I would like to ask you how we can consider as well the indigenous communities inside these frameworks and criteria that we are all developing. This question goes for each one of you. So if anyone would like to jump into, feel free.
Can I take this, Maria Alejandra?
Sure. Yes, Lisa.
In my previous life, before I was working at eFund, and there I also worked for 5 years with the Indigenous Peoples programs. So I had the privilege to speak to them directly and know something about the Indigenous peoples. They have very specific characteristics, which I adore. And what is really characterizing them in their connection with the place they live is that for them, the land, the Mother Earth, represents their cultural living for the family and the communities. So it's something it's a link, it's a bond that really goes beyond the fact of living on one space. It's between cultural and spiritual. And this is, I think, very peculiar for the indigenous peoples, but it's also something that should have us reflect on the fact that there is not only the economic aspects in the agricultural system, there's also the cultural aspects And there are also some very specific elements that we should consider when we attempt an approach of regenerative agriculture. And the framework that we are all willing to build, and I'm also very happy to doing it in collaboration with Regen10, because Regen10 is a platform where we have voice and we can really, all the actors can really express their needs and mandates, because there is a need to also respect the difference in terms of culture, of history, of context. So I think it is an element more that we also should consider in our future discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. Stefania, do you want to add anything to this question?
I would add also only what we are doing in Regen10. So I could not agree more with what Luisa was saying, is the work that the team has done, for example, on identifying the principles. We have then also identified the values and beliefs that are around the system. So this is quite, I think you were referring to something quite important when we're looking at a holistic approach. It's much more than just the outcomes, a non-prescriptive maybe list of practices or agricultural farming systems just to indicate what we're talking about. It's also about the beliefs and values that are around it. So I could not agree more. And in the Regen10 work, so the work that we're actually driving together, it's something we have acknowledged and are working towards.
Thank you, Stefania. We have another interesting question from the audience, and I think that this is what is going to make us realize how regenerative agriculture is not just about the concept, it's about how we can make it a reality, considering the particularity of each country, of each territory. It's not the same to think about regenerative agriculture here in Europe than maybe in Africa, or we think about maybe Latin American countries. So this question says like this: promoting and supporting regenerative agriculture system in Bangladesh, it's an initiative that this person has been trying to lead for a while, but there are some challenges, as food security is the major problem. Land is very limited there, and farmer is not in the position to make the land free for the next season. How they can implement regenerative agriculture criteria in a country like Bangladesh? Rachel, I would like to know about your opinion. I know that you have as well international experience, and you have been getting very close to transitions in different contexts. So what do you think about this?
Thank you, Maria. Unfortunately, my international experience doesn't actually extend to Bangladesh. So my background is more Africa and China. I will attempt to answer, but I think Theo may be in a better position to talk from experience with different frameworks on the ground for this. Given that regenerative agriculture is more a set of principles and outcomes, there isn't going to be a single way of doing it in different contexts. The approach in different countries, regions, different parts of different countries is going to be very specific to the context on the ground. So I'm looking at the comment here. They said the food security is the major problem, land is very limited, and the farmers are not in a position to free up the land for the next season. Now, this is a number of problems in one. Food security is not going to improve under kind of conventional monoculture agriculture, not in the long term. It's a very short-term solution, is intensive agriculture. It depletes the land. It requires ever more intensive inputs of fertilizer, of pesticides, of water. So looking back from a leisure point of view, long term, you don't have food security with intensive agriculture. Now, obviously, the long term is definitely a leisure point of view if you're trying to feed your family and trying to get enough money to live in the short term. This is where I think corporates have a role. If these people are involved in the supply chain, then they need to be engaged from the buyers to support the change. So if they need loans to tide them over to the next season, or if they need inputs, of knowledge, of tools, of potentially more land, then I think this needs to come from the entire supply chain. There's also definitely a role for governments. Now, regenerative agriculture is going to lead to outcomes that are very beneficial to the wider society. So it's not ultimately fair or reasonable to expect a single farmer or a single group of people to bear all the risks and all the costs of making these improvements. So there's definitely a role for governments to support different actors, particularly farmers who may already be in a vulnerable position to make the changes that are needed. And again, then there's a role for the financial institutions to come in with the necessary finance. But private finance may have less of a role when you've got vulnerable actors on the ground. There, I would say that's more of a role for governments to provide interest-free credit and interest-free loans and that kind of technical support. So I don't have a very clear answer to what you should do in Bangladesh, but I hope that's provide a little bit of context to the role that all the different actors need to take in this, and that it's not just for farmers to take on all of the responsibility themselves.
Thank you, Rachel. I would like to ask you, Theodora, if you would like to add to this question.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on it, just on the particular point that you're mentioning around food security, and I think it's so crucial. We did a big review of all the different practices that are associated with regenerative agriculture and how they can lead to 3 different outcomes: biodiversity, climate change, mitigation, and yield. We saw an overwhelming amount of evidence that really showed that these practices were leading to positive outcomes around climate mitigation and biodiversity. However, the yield one was very sort of difficult to get the answers that we wanted. It was sort of either like very contradictory evidence, or there wasn't enough evidence, or the way that yield was being measured was very mixed. So what really came out of this work that we did was showing that you can't start implementing practices that you think will be beneficial for biodiversity and climate mitigation without being really conscious of the food security element, because that shows us focusing on one sustainability dimension leads to big trade-offs. If you're practicing certain practices and you boost the biodiversity in that land, but if that's sort of reducing your yields, that can lead to sort of encroachment into higher, more biodiverse lands in different areas. So it really teased out this trade-off piece. And I don't have the answers to exactly what should happen in Bangladesh, but I think the point that you're raising is really important, that actually when you're looking at any kind of regenerative, you really need to look at this food security point. And another one would be that regenerative is also sort of associated with diversification. So you've got sort of cover crops, intercropping, agroforestry, which is can sort of de-risk if you're using one crop all the time, but actually you're growing sort of more crops on that land, which is better to spread the economic risk if there is something bad that happens to one crop at that particular time. And then also understanding how sort of the diversification approach happening in that land can support food security in that local environment. Again, if you're just growing one crop, that's not going to be supporting the food security within that area as well. So diversification strategies are really important for this de-risking element, but also to enhance food security for that local area.
Thank you, Theo. Now we have another question that can be connected to this previous one, and this is coming from Romano de Vivo. He's asking, how does the dialogue surrounding these global outcomes align with the coverage of locally adapted technologies and practices? Once again, regenerative agriculture might change depending on the territory of the country, even if we would like to talk about one standardized understanding. So how does the dialogue surrounding these global outcomes align with the coverage of locally adapted technologies and practices? Luisa, I know that from the farmer's perspective, you can understand very well that particularity.
Yes, I can. I can try at least, because the argument, the topic is so complex. But even in this perspective, I think that's the role of the public sector, the governments, more on the political framework plays a big role, because also in terms of how do we want to apply the principles of regenerative agriculture at country level, at local level, really depends on the opportunities that companies and farmers as well have at country level. So there are two things. One is, I think, the strengthening the collaboration at country level between companies, extension service partners, for example, and farmers to introduce new innovation and technical tools at farm gates, but also there is the role of the government when it comes to the structure of this process. Because one example for all, and I also maybe at that point on the financial topic that we discussed before, farmers they are not scared of making investments, but of course, to make investments, you need to access funds. And there is, in some countries, farmers are not even owners of the land. So they are not even able to grant collaterals, which is a matter that is then stopping the full process, for example. So that's why I'm saying we really need to look at the situations country by country and see what are the elements and the actors that are needed to be involved. There is one element, for example, when it comes to women farmers, that are those who work the most in the farm, but women farmers in most of the countries in the developing world, they don't own the land. So they are not really able to even think of introducing innovation, making investments. So my answer to Romano is look at the local situations and see what actors can be involved. Maybe the role of our international global organizations can be that of creating the link between the discussions at global level and what is then happening on the ground and the other way around.
Thank you, Luisa. Stefania, do you agree with Lisa?
Yes, and that was such an important point, Luisa, also for the question on Bangladesh. There's in some countries, access to land is extremely hard. It's a real hurdle, and so effectively, when we're talking about transitioning, investing in the transition, it cannot work. It's a real obstacle. As is also the aging population of farmers, and Luisa can talk a lot, I think, about that too. It's hard to ask a 50-year-old or 63-year-old farmer to actually invest in the whole transition of its farm when he knows he's at the end of his lifetime, and maybe he's not even passing his farms to his children, but more selling it unfortunately, for the extending urbanization. I think I find it fascinating starting to work on new agricultural models, because you see how Lisa was saying, everything is interconnected. So there are some other systemic issues like access to land, aging farmer population, and the available arable land that are real issues that need to be solved hand in hand. I just wanted to emphasize maybe one point that is important, at least from our side, and we did a couple of studies on this too, which is, I would love to move the conversations only looking at yields, but looking really at farm profitability, because when we're looking at farm economics, it's really about improving farm profitability. And with unstable climate conditions, I think we just need to also stop dreaming that we will increase our yields until never ending. I think we are actually seeing, and I'm not an expert, but statistics are showing that yields are plateauing or almost decreasing in the last 5 to 10 years. And the reason why is actually also due to extreme climate and weather events and the instability that we have. And this is why climate mitigation plays a big role. And this is why agricultural practices and models like regenerative agriculture studies have shown actually contribute to also to counterbalance the effect of flooding and etc. So this is an important point. And on farm profitability, what I want to say is that the few studies we have done show that there is an increase in farmer profitability, despite the drop when and the investment you make in the transition. There is a transition gap, and then it goes back up. And farmers who have adopted a regenerative farming model are more profitable. So that is one first thing that I wanted to say. And the other thing that we saw when we're looking at what are the financing needs, there is a real need for collaboration between public and private funding. And Luisa was telling about all the drivers in the value chain need to be aligned. And today we know governments play such a big role in many countries, subsidizing also agriculture. If the value chain, if the drivers along the value chains are not aligned, it's very hard to move a large portion of our agricultural sectors towards new agricultural models. So here, this is why a strong collaboration is needed. This is why financial actors play a big role in this point. And I think Rachel wants to complement.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this because it's something that we haven't mentioned, and I know we've just got a couple of minutes left, so it's probably a terrible time to bring it up. But this is fair prices for farmers, and is there going to be a price premium, or are consumers willing to pay a price premium for more sustainable agriculture? And in some instances, they seem willing to, with organic farming certification bringing a price premium in many cases. But this again comes back to what's the role of the corporates and the retailers, and also maybe governments in mandating pricing in agriculture. And it's a question that I'd love to throw open in the 2 minutes that we have left of this conversation, to understand, in this cost of living crisis that we're currently facing, is it who should be paying the premium for this more sustainable, or the cost of switching to more sustainable agricultural methods? Is it the consumer? Is it the corporate who needs to just kind of suck it up? Or is it the governments who need to repurpose their subsidies to support this?
I can start, but I would love to know what Luis and Theo think. What I keep on telling the VP of procurement whenever we talk, I always say your procurement buying practices determine how the landscape looks like. So I think I just want to acknowledge that there is a huge role that off-takers, so value chain players, need to play and the true value of food. And so I would say my answer is it's a shared cost. So probably also a consumer down the line will also eventually have it, but every actor in the value chain, and especially the off-takers, and the redistribution of value is not fair. So here it's Stefania speaking, but I think that's an important point. Would love to hear what Luisa says from the farmer's point of view.
Can I go ahead, Maria Alejandra?
Yes.
Of course, I agree with Stefania on this. And not only as Luisa's point, but also as World Farmers Organization, there must be a decentralization of power in the value chain. This is absolutely needed. And in this process, of course, also the responsibilities, the cost, the value should be totally redistributed. So also my answer is all the actors in the value chain, including the consumers.
Thank you, Lisa. Theo, do you like to add anything to this question? It's actually the point.
Maybe just really, really quickly, and I agree with what's been said, but I also think there's so much room for government subsidies to shift to actually support regenerative. And I think basing that around regenerative outcomes is also really, really crucial. So I don't think there's sort of one stakeholder that has to take the front of it all, but I do think there's a really important role for government that wasn't mentioned earlier as well.
Thank you, Theo. I know that we are running out of time, but I don't want this to be just about the webinar. The idea is to continue these conversations in other spaces. So I really would like to encourage everyone in the audience to reach out to any one of us here in the panel. We'll be happy to continue addressing your questions, understanding how we can join forces, how we can work all together. At the end of the day, we all want the transition of the sector. We would like to make the change, but for doing that, we need to join forces. So let's discover how we can do that. So I would like to thank to each one of you. Thank you so much, Rachel, Theodora, Luisa, Stefania, Sean as well, who joined us at the beginning, for being part of this discussion. I really look forward for more discussions. So for sure, we're gonna have more spaces. For those that were asking and bringing very interesting comments, don't worry, we will reach out so we will be able to address properly all your concerns. So thank you so much for being here. Stay tuned because the conversation will continue. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. It's been great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.